To update the state, we need to add a counter ID parameter here, so we know which counter we need to remove from this list. Now, to make sure that all the plumbing is going to work, before updating the state, first, let's just display counter ID on the console. Now we need to go back to our counter component. Here's our delete button. We need to change this expression and pass the ID of this counter. So as you have learned before, we pass an arrow function, and here we call onDelete with this.props.id. Now let's test this. So back in the browser, I'm going to delete the first counter. You can see the ID of that counter is 1. Beautiful. Let's try another one. That is counter with ID 2. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and update the state. Here in the counters component, as I told you before, in React, we do not update the state directly. In other words, we're not going to remove a counter from this array. Instead, we're going to create a new array without a given counter, and then call the setState method of our component and let React update the state. So here I'm going to define a new constant, call it counters. We're going to set this to this.state.counters. Use the filter method to get all the counters except the one with the given ID. So C goes to C.id does not equal counter ID. Now we have a new array. So let's call this.setState. Pass an object. We want to overwrite the counters property with this counters constant. Also, as I told you before, here, because the key and value are the same, we can simplify this code like this. Now, let's test this. So back in the browser, I'm going to delete the first counter, gone, another one, beautiful. So our implementation is working, but there is a tiny issue here that I would like to improve. If you look at the render method of this component, here we're passing 3 props to our child component. OnDelete, which is a function, as well as value and ID. Now, one question you might have is, why do we have to pass ID and key while their values are exactly the same? This looks like unnecessary repetition. The reason for this is because this key attribute is used internally by React, so we won't be able to access it in our counter component. That's why we have to pass ID as a prop and then read it via this.props.id. Now, the tiny issue we have here is that we have passed value and ID as separate props. Both these are properties of the counter object. If in the future we add a new property to our counter object, we'll have to come back here and set a new prop, like selected. We set it to counter.selected. And over time, this is going to get messy and ugly. The whole point of using objects is to encapsulate related values. So instead of these 3 properties, we could simply pass the counter object itself. This object includes everything we need to know about a counter. And also, if in the future we add a new property to this counter object, we don't have to come back here and modify this code. Our counter object is carrying all the data about a counter. So with this change, now we need to go back to our counter component and make a couple more changes. Here on line 23, this is where we have our delete button. We need to change this expression. We no longer have the ID property in our props object, so we need to prefix this with counter. Similarly, on the top, where we initialize our state, again, we don't have the value property. We need to prefix it with counter. Save the changes. Let's test the application. So we can increment each counter, beautiful, and delete them. Perfect.